Hello, you bread machine lovers, bakers of bread, makers of the home. Welcome to Butterfly Meadows Homestead, where hearts are warmed and bodies are nourished. I wanted to bring to you some tips that hopefully will help you be successful in making bread in your bread machine. So right now in my bread machine, I have some sourdough going. So it's got to sit here for 6 hours, and then I will knead it again and let it sit overnight and be baking it in the morning. And I have a video, and I'll try to put the card here, for making sourdough in the bread machine. I also have a playlist of bread machine functions and cycles telling you what each one of them does, and I'll put a link to that here. And that is also very useful to understand what all the different settings on your bread machine do. So you've got a bread machine. Maybe somebody gave you one. Maybe you got one for Christmas. Um, or you just are interested in starting to make your own homemade bread and you bought a bread machine. So you make your first loaf and you're all excited. It comes out a brick. Perhaps it didn't rise, or it's hard as a rock, or it's dry, or it's crumbly. For whatever reason, it failed. Perhaps you got discouraged, but I want to encourage you not to give up. But I have some tips that will help you be successful. I make bread almost every day, every other day at least, and sometimes every day in my bread machine. And very rarely do I have a failure. Very rarely do I have a fail. That didn't used to be the case when I first started making bread, but as I learned the things that I needed to watch for, and of course, when you do something over and over again, you get really good at it. So I want to encourage you to keep trying. And I want to encourage you to make bread in your bread machine. It is so easy. It is so much less work than it is making it by hand. And the bread comes out, real uniform in shape usually, and delicious. And usually every loaf is almost just exactly like the loaf before, unless you change something. Tip number one that I want to talk about is your ingredients. A lot of people ask me, can I use all-purpose flour? They're making bread in their bread machine and they want to use all-purpose flour. And I have seen the videos and blogs out there that say you can use all-purpose flour. I've always used all-purpose flour. It comes out fine. But it may not work for you. I don't use all-purpose flour for bread in my bread machine. All-purpose flour has its purpose, but not for making like sandwich bread and breads that need that structure and that gluten that bread flour can give it. So just because someone else said they use all-purpose flour does not mean it's going to work for you. And if you do use all-purpose flour, there are some things that you're going to have to pay attention to, and maybe some extra steps you may take. And I'm not going to get into that in this video. Perhaps I can do a follow-up video and cover that kind of thing later. But use a good bread flour. I use a high gluten bread flour, and I don't have any trouble with it. I love the bread flour that I use. Now, I know a lot of people may not have access to this bread flour. I buy it in bulk, and I had a link in my Amazon store. You can check my Amazon link below. See if you like that bread flour if you want to purchase that bread flour there. You want to get a high gluten bread flour, a good bread flour. Not all bread flours have the same amount of protein in them. And when you are looking at the amount of protein in your bread flour, it is not, you don't go to the nutritional facts. That is not the same thing as the protein that is in the flour. It should be listed somewhere on the bag what the protein level is. And I would recommend 12 to 13% is what you're looking for. And that will always give you a good turnout on your bread. The ingredients that you use are very important. You want to use the best ingredients that you can find if you want the best loaf of bread to be your outcome. The bread machine is not a set it and forget it type of appliance. A lot of people think it's a dump it in, walk away type of appliance, and it's not. This is a machine. When you're making bread, people who make bread by hand, you will hear them talk about all the time how they like to knead the bread by hand because they learn the feel of the dough and they know when their dough is just right. Well, the bread machine is not human in any way and does not have any kind of sensors like that. It does not know the feel of the dough. That dough may be too wet or too dry. The bread machine does not know what is it's just doing. It's kneading and going through its cycle. It does not know the contents that are inside of that pan and what they may look like. So when you put your ingredients, all of your ingredients in your machine and you turn it on, open that lid and look at what is being mixed up. Is it mixing well? You may need to scrape down the sides. It may be too dry. Do you see a lot of dry flour? Is the ball forming nice and smooth? After like 3 or 4 minutes of kneading, you should begin to see a ball form. And after even more kneading, it should be very smooth. Touch the dough ball. Make sure that it's soft and subtle and it's not too firm and too hard. If your dough ball is too dry, it's going to be too firm, and that's going to prevent it from rising and being nice and fluffy like you want your bread to be. And there is no harm in taking the paddle out of your bread pan once it has finished kneading. You're going to want to do this before the last ferment. Now on the KBS machine, that would be ferment 3, which is actually the second ferment on most all of the cycles, but it'll say ferment 3. When it begins, then go ahead and take that paddle out and shape your dough back into a nice round ball, and that is going to give you a nice uniformly shaped loaf of bread. If you leave the paddle in and you don't reshape your dough ball, you may get a loaf of bread that is lopsided, and of course there's going to be that hole in the bottom when you take the bread out of the machine. When your bread has finished baking, when the cycle is complete, you are going to want to remove the pan from the bread machine. Most bread machines have a keep warm cycle, and that'll keep the bread warm inside the bread maker until you remove it. Most of them go an hour to 30 minutes. You are going to want to take your pan out of the machine and turn the machine off, because if you leave it in there during the keep warm cycle, it's going to dry out your bread and you're going to have very dry bread. I always remove it immediately. And depending on what kind of bread I'm making, I let it sit in the bread pan for just a minute or two, not long, and shake the pan and make sure that it is loose on all the sides. And go ahead and take it out and put it on a cooling rack. Because if you leave it in the pan, which I have heard some people suggest that you leave it in the bread machine until it's cool, that is not a good idea. It's going to get dry and then it's going to sweat. If you don't get it out of that pan while it's cooling off, it's going to sweat and give you a soggy crust, and you don't want that. So you're going to want to remove it from the bread machine, and then you're going to want to remove it pretty quickly from the bread pan itself. Now, when the bread is hot and warm, it is very delicate, so you got to be very careful with it because you could smash it and smush it, and you don't want to do that. So just gently take it out and sit it on a cooling rack, and I cover mine with a little cotton towel while it cools. And then after it's cool, you can seal it up, remove as much air from the bag and seal it up, and it should stay fresh for several days. But also, you don't want to slice into your bread while it's warm. You want to let the bread cool before you slice into it, because if you don't, the inside of the bread, the crumb of the bread is going to get very gummy. It's going to change the texture altogether. So let the bread cool, and then you can slice it and store it. Now, for some other questions that I get, I'm always getting questions about substituting ingredients, especially things like the milk. Some recipes call for dry milk, and some recipes call for regular milk, and some recipes call for water, some recipes call for an egg, and some don't. And I'm always getting questions about, can I use this instead of that, or this instead of that? And of course, you can substitute ingredients, but when you start changing ingredients in a recipe, you've changed the recipe. So it's not the same recipe anymore, and you're probably not going to get the same results. So just make sure that if you substitute, let's say a recipe is using powdered milk or dry milk, and you want to use regular milk, that's a liquid. So you're going to have to decrease the water by the same amount that you are adding the milk. Otherwise, you're going to have too much liquid. And let's say you don't want to use an egg, or you want to use an egg. That's a liquid. So you're also going to have to adjust your liquid amount by that. I often get questions about the sugar. Most bread recipes call for some sugar. And yes, the yeast does feed off of the sugar, but the yeast also feeds off of the starches in the flour. So the sugar is not the only food that the yeast is going to have. Yes, you can leave the sugar out of almost any recipe and it should be fine. But you may get different results. Like I said before, when you start substituting ingredients and taking out ingredients, it's a different recipe. So you shouldn't expect the exact same results. They're going to be a little different. That doesn't mean it's going to be bad. It's just probably going to be a little different than it would have been if you'd have left the recipe exactly like it was. I also get comments a lot. People will say, I followed your steps exactly and my bread didn't turn out. Like I said at the beginning of this video, you have to check that dough ball. I use 3 cups of flour in most of my standard loaves of bread. But 3 cups of flour for me, the way I measure my flour, and 3 cups of flour for you, and the way you measure your flour could be totally different amounts of flour because I don't normally weigh my flour. I may put in the description when I put the recipe how much 3 cups of flour should weigh, but that does not mean that's how much mine weighed. That's just a calculation of what a cup of flour should weigh, and I'm trying to help those who want to weigh and not use a cup. But they are different amounts. Flour settles, flour gets packed. So when you measure that flour, it's going to be different amounts. That's why it is so important to look inside of this bread machine. Does it need more liquid? Does it need more flour? And the only way you're going to know that is by looking at your dough ball. You want a soft, smooth dough ball. You don't want one that's all oopy and gooey, and you don't want one that is so firm that the bread machine has trouble kneading it. Because if it does, if it's struggling because that dough ball is so tight and so firm, then your bread is just not going to rise. And if it's too gooey and too wet and is not forming a nice round smooth ball, then your bread probably is going to cave in. It's going to rise up beautiful and begin to bake and just cave in because there's too much liquid. That can also happen when you're using a flour that does not have enough protein in it. It'll rise up beautifully and then cave in. All of these things are important. I would say if you want to learn how to use your bread machine successfully every time, is keep an eye on that dough ball. Look inside. Look at that dough ball. Learn what a good dough ball should look like. When it first starts mixing, it's going to take 3 or 4 minutes for everything to get incorporated. But after that, then you should be able to tell if you have too much liquid or if you don't have enough liquid. I think that is the number one key. Make sure you have the right amount of liquid in your machine, in your dough, before it moves on. Because if it's too dry or it's too wet, you're not going to have a good outcome. Don't dump it in and walk away. When you put it all in there, open that lid and watch it. Take a little rubber spatula, scrape down the sides, help it along. It's a machine. It's not a human. It doesn't know that there may be clumps of flour here or there, or that it's not getting all the ingredients. It still takes a load of work off of you, but you're going to have to manage it and look at it and not just dump and go. Now, perhaps you like to use the delay, the reservation setting. I wouldn't recommend that unless you have made multiple loaves of bread that turned out successfully and you didn't have to change anything. So you've got the hang of it, you got the knack, then you can trust your machine to do its thing. But if this is your first or second or third loaf and you're not sure if you're going to have to add or adjust, then it's not the time to dump it in and set the timer and walk away because you don't know what it might need. I hope you will get that machine and start using it. You might make some mistakes, even a lot of times the failures. You can still eat. Maybe it might make better toast than it does a sandwich, but it doesn't have to go to waste. And if you're like me and you have chickens, they love bread. So there's always that. You can use it for chicken feed or feed for your animals. But just keep trying. It's not just because it's a bread machine. Bread machines are wonderful. It's a wonderful invention, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to use your brain and use your skills as well. It still takes you managing that dough ball and making sure everything is going well. I hope this video was helpful. Please like and share and subscribe if you have not already done so. And thank you for coming and joining me. Leave me a comment below. Let me know what questions I can answer for you, and I will try to do my best. God bless. Bye-bye.